that's the reason why some of this is quite old. This came out of the barren acreage as of 1970. I don't know why I've got 1968 here, but anyway, it's in my notes, but it's 1970. And you can see the rankings that are involved. And somebody started asking the question, what did the rankings mean? The rank, of course, is based on the quantity of wine, not on the acreage involved. The rank on the left is the acreage. The rank on the right is the wine production. And just taking a glance at this, you can get some idea. Did you get both hands up? The world acreage and course outline? Neither one? Paul, did you get both hands up?
Total acreage I did.
Okay. And it's just interesting to look at this a little bit because it gives you some idea of where wine is produced and the relative importance of wine and table grapes and raisins in the world. For example, Italy there ranks second in acreage, but first in total wine production, which may surprise some of you who think, what goes on here? Yeah, we've got France in second with less wine production than Italy. And that happened also in '68, so that's the era somebody was calling to my attention. So actually France is still #1 with Italy right behind it. But remember, all of these from any given year, as I'll point out as we go on through this morning on statistics, you've got to take into account a plus or minus 5% variation from year to year at the minimum. And then also, as I'll point out later on, some of these statistics you've got to take with a couple of grains of salt because they're not always correct, even though this is the official publication of the wine industry, this publication from the International Office of VEN116a. But to say there's a few things I want to point out. Notice that we have a world total of about 24.5 or roughly 25 million acres, but 3 countries, and certainly 4 countries, account for over half of that. The first 4 countries, see, are 7, 10, 11, 12, 13 million out of the 24 million are represented by the first 4 countries. And notice the terrific acreage that Turkey has, but notice where they stand in wine production. And remember I said yesterday that those countries go heavy on table and raisin grapes as you swing from Turkey southward around the Mediterranean because they do not wine drinking is supposedly forbidden in those countries. Then the Algeria ranks 8th. That's an interesting one because once upon a time Algeria ranked right behind France when the French ran Algeria, but since they've moved out, Algeria's dropped, and I dare say that this figure given for Algeria is slightly blown up. They're probably down about where we are in California now. Also notice that Argentina there, although it's 9th in acreage, is the 5th greatest wine producing country in the world. And this is of interest because it is in our hemisphere here. The Argentinians, along with the Italians and the French and the Spanish and the Argentinians, drink over 30 gallons of wine per capita per year. I'll mention later on we drink less than right now, even though we think we've gone crazy over wine drinking, we're still about 1.5 gallons per person in the United States. But noticing then and keeping in mind that these are just roughly general figures, but Russia is one that has really come up in the past 10 years. And we're not really sure the data we get from Russia any more than we're sure where the satellites are. But this is the best national bulletin we put together. I don't think that's more. Oh, I see. But remember then also what I told you, that you've got to know the top 5 countries in each of these areas, and you may be asked to rank them, and whether it's in wine grapes or wine production or table grapes or raisins, and you have to keep in mind roughly where California itself stands in the world. And you'll notice here I went down through number 14 so I could pick up California as ranking about 14th in the world in wine production. This was back in, as I say, 1970, which means the data came from probably 68 and 69. The other interesting thing is, now keep in mind, I want a few things here, that the world total is about roughly, so far as you're concerned, 25 million acres, and we produce 8 billion gallons of wine in the world. And that compares to about 10 billion gallons of beer produced in the world. But to me, it's rather interesting to remember that when you make beer, you take some barley and soak it in water and add a lot of water and add more water and so forth, so that beer is a lot of the, well, of course, all the liquid in beer, except for that that's converted, of course, to alcohol, is water, added water. But in wine, so that's 10 billion gallons of beer, which is impressive. But more impressive to me is the idea of 8 billion gallons of wine, all of which comes out of grape berries. Every drop of the water, if they're honest, comes out of a berry. So it's one thing to ferment a little malt and add water to it and make 10 billion gallons of beer, but it's another thing to grow enough grapes to produce 8 billion gallons of juice, of grape juice. So that's where we stand on the world situation. And I say these rankings, in some cases where you see in this top 14 where you see a high number like 10 to 14, so it just reflects that one of two things: either that they are stronger on table grapes and raisins than they are on wine, or as in case of Spain, with the greatest acreage of all, but only ranking 4th in wine, basically reflects the poor production that they get in Spain, for their poor soils and lack of irrigation, lack of water supply. So you see, if you're looking at this, Algeria with only 765,000 acres, Argentina with 725,000 acres makes almost as much wine as Spain does, with about more than 5 times the acreage. So the soil in Spain is generally rather unproductive, partly because of fertility and partly because of lack of water. All right, that's the world picture on wine acreage and wine grapes. And we want to go on and look at the world picture so far as table grapes are concerned. Remember where California ranks. That'll be important. And California's probably moved up now to probably about, instead of 7th ranking, 7th in wine production, it's probably more like 6th with the emphasis we've had in the recent years with wine production. I did have a handout for you on the table grapes, similar to this, and on the raisins, but spending an hour or so yesterday afternoon checking and double checking, I got so disgusted with the data that's in these reference books that I decided it was no good at all, and went back to some other work that I'd gotten from the raisin industry and our California data. For example, they showed, just to give you a little a viewpoint on this business, that you don't believe everything you read, this International Office publication showed that Japan produced half as many table grapes as California, and that Turkey produced 1/3 of the world's table grapes. and they showed Australia is producing something like 30,000 tons of raisins, and both Leiter, who's been there, and Dr. Cleaver's been there, and a visitor in our office at the moment, when we're discussing this, who is an Australian, says that there's no doubt about they produce 90,000 tons, and yet the data shows 30,000 tons. Well, what sort of data is that? But we have something that's a little bit better, and so I'll just write this on the board for you. This is the table grape situation, and again, I'm just going to give you the top 5, because I think that takes care of illustrating the point. California, regardless of what that bulletin and everything says, California still ranks 1st in table grape production, and with somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 tons takeaway, plus or minus 10%, 5 or 10%, as I told you before. Then Turkey is next, and this is, of course, commercial table grapes. Turkey was, and I'm really rounding these off now, with about 300,000 tons. Italy with about 250,000. Russia with about 140,000. And Syria, of all countries, coming in here with about 120,000. So that takes care of the top 5, which you're expected to know. Those of you who might want a little bit more data, I'll run through the rest of the top 10, but this is what I want you to know. Spain comes in next with about 100,000, Romania with 70, Greece with about 65, Bulgaria with 65, and Morocco with 50,000. So that the total world production then of table grapes is estimated to run about 2,500,000 tons. This is table grapes now, in addition to all the wine data that you had on the other. So this is the estimated total table grape production of the world. So it leaves California with their 500,000 tons here, representing roughly about 20% of the world total. And that's what you need to know, that California ranks first, and that's roughly 20% of the world's total on table grapes. Now we go to raisins. I say this, I sometimes tell the class that for many of you this is the most boring lecture of all because it's all statistics, but you've got to have an oversight of the whole situation before we settle down to growing grapes in California. Okay, we get into raisins, and here California, of course, is the big dominating country or state or area of the world. Almost say country here. California produces year in and year out an average of about 200,000 tons of raisins. And remember, for notes that you'll catch on a little bit later, that this represents, you have to take fresh grapes, if you're figuring production, it takes about 4.5 tons fresh to equal 1 ton of raisins. It should be 4 to 1, but we know from experience that people harvested grapes for raisins a little too early, so it takes about 4.5 tons to equal 1 ton of raisins. So you multiply this by 4.5 to get the amount of grapes that go into raisins. In other words, roughly 1 million tons.
Is there any overlap between those figures and the ones in the table?
No, this is table grapes shipped to market. So yeah, good point. So California really dominates the raisin picture, mainly because of this long, dry summer and no rains and good soil and plenty of water and good fall dry, sun drying season. Greece comes in next with about 100,000. They have 100,000 of Zante currants. This is 100,000 of Zante, or it's actually, they're not currants as you all know, they're black Corinth grapes, but Greece dominates the world in the production of black Corinth. And then in addition to that, they produce about 50,000 plus 50,000 of Thompson seedless. Then third place comes in Turkey. See, Turkey was low on wine with their big acreage, but they're high on table grapes and on raisins. So Turkey comes in, my figure says 85,000 tons of raisins. And then we come to Australia. I told you before that the data indicated something like 90,000 for last year, and this is broken down into, well, so far as you're concerned, 75,000 of Thompson seedless, and and about 15,000 of these anti-currant or black Corinth. We're going to start calling them black Corinth from now on, to give about 90,000 total. 1, 2, 3, 4, and the fifth country we pick up would be Iran. Iran with about 55,000 tons of raisins. And then for those of you who might be interested, that's what I want you to know, but for those of you who have particular interest, Russia would come next with about the same as Iran. And most of that is from the area in Russia called Turkestan, which is there north of those two seas, the Black Sea and the Caspian. And then Syria comes in next with about 25,000, Spain with about 15,000, South Africa with about 7,000, and Morocco with about 1,500. I say that's just in case you wanted information. To give a total world picture of total world now, something around 500 to 550,000 tons of raisins. That's the world picture here, then the world total. And of course on table grapes and on raisins, you don't know how much of this is consumed on the farm and how much actually gets to market. But this gives you some, not quantitative, but qualitative, a picture of the situation in the world so far as grapes are concerned. You see, if we make 200,000 out of 500,000, that's 40%. So we are somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% of the world's raisins, 15 to 20% of the table grapes. Now, I made this slip and said California is a country, and that isn't too much of a slip because remember we're talking about, in this course from now on, we're going to be talking about Vitis vinifera. And except for a few thousand acres over in Arizona and maybe a couple of thousand up in the states of Oregon and Washington, all the vinifera grown in the United States is in California. But just considering grapes in total, whether you're talking about Concords or what have you, California has about 80%, and this sort of data you need to put down, about 80% of the U.S. total acreage. 80% of the U.S. total acreage, but over 90% of the total production. Over 90% of the grapes grown in the United States are grown in California. And if you want another little a twister, 1/3 of the grapes grown in the United States are grown in Fresno County. 1/3 of all the grapes grown in this big country are grown in Fresno County. So we have about 2% of the world acreage, but about 6% of the world's crop, which ought to automatically lead you to the idea that California's production is 3 times the world average. That's the production per acre. We are producing now in the neighborhood of close to 7 tons per acre on a statewide basis. And for those of you who deal in a metric system, that approximates 17 tons per hectarea. So this is the situation where we stand on the ability to produce in California. We produce about 2 or 3% of the world's wine. About 1/3, as I point out here, or more of the world's raisins, and 15 to 20% of the world's commercial table grapes. Now, raisins are an important California production, as I said earlier, because of the exceptionally good environment we have for growing that type of product of the grape. We've got good deep soils, sandy soils. They're produced heavily. The Thompson seedless seems to be just to be a rabbit in a briar patch. It's almost really at home in the San Joaquin Valley, and we have plenty of water so far, and plenty of good soil so far, and a good heavy producing variety in the Thompson, and a long dry fall in which we can have sun drying conditions. We're important in table grapes, partly for the same reason that we have no summer rains and no high humidities. So the only real problem of serious importance in our table production is the powdery mildew, and that's usually taken care of with nothing but sulfur dust. If you try to grow table grapes in Europe, you're going to have to spray them with Bordeaux, which is copper sulfate and lime, and that mottles the fruit and makes it look bad. And of course, in order to have really high quality, you've got to have good-looking fruit that colors nicely and gets high sugar. And much of Europe isn't high enough temperatures to get good sugar. We have the high temperatures, the low humidity, and the lack of rainfall in order to produce good table fruit. Plus the fact, in other words, that's a climate effect, plus the fact that Americans still only drinking 1.5 gallons per person on wine are eating a lot, still eating quite a few table grapes. So our diet is pointed toward eating fresh fruit. Now, in this whole picture then of grape production, we can bring so many things over I'll lose them all. Fortunately, I can remember part of it. Now, we have a slide. It's the one that's, we have the slide that's in, there's a slide of the graph that's in your textbook, the old textbook, which gives a typical distribution of the use of grapes in California. But I wanted to bring it up to date with a new slide, or at least a handout of the revised one for the new text. When I went in to see Dr. Winkler about getting that one page out of our proofreading, he says that they're all down in Berkeley. So as soon as I get that back, I'll give you a up-to-date breakdown on this. But for the moment, let's look at this and see where the California grapes go. We just talked about the table and wine and raisin situation. Let's see where our grapes go. Did we have a slide then? Right behind you. Now, before we go on that, since this was on here, I said I'd show you this slide today. And here's the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And here's the Caucasian Mountains. And this is the home of Vitis vinifera in this mountain range here, separating Turkey from Lower Russia. So here's where Vitis vinifera originated. Sometimes to say it in class doesn't mean so much as to take a quick look. Here's the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, and over here is the Mediterranean, and here's Turkey. And of course, this is, you can understand why grapes then are so important to Turkey, since that's the home of where they originated. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, this graph is in your textbook, but unless you're a whole lot smarter than I am, it's awfully hard to follow and figure out what's going on. The only way you can understand this graph is to go from the top down and never go back. In other words, don't jump around. You see, out of all of our grapes, do we have such a thing as a pointer? Huh? None there? Well, why not point with here something? Who's got a ruler? Well, okay, a pencil. Well, this will be. You see, taking all of our grapes, start at the top. Now, I'm following me through this. This is a number of years old, and I'll give you some modifications of it here in a moment. But considering all our grapes in California, 56% of them at this time, 10 years or so ago, were raisin varieties. That means Thompson seedless and Muscat especially, and a little Zany currants, but mostly Thompson seedless. And out of the total amount of grapes produced, which is up here 2,800,000 in that particular year, you see over half of them are the raisin variety types. Now, of these raisin variety types, about 11% are sold as fresh fruit. Don't look at this. I want you to stay with me up here. Out of these raisin varieties, about 10 or 11% are sold as fresh fruit. That's your Thompson seedless on the market in the grocery store. And about 58%, or a little slightly over half of them, are made into raisins. But here's one of the bad things about the California wine industry is that 30% word that table grapes are two-way grapes. And that's what we mean by the term two-way grapes. They can either go, the best ones can go, the good ones go for shipping and packing, and the culls, or strippings as we call them, go to the winery. One reason why the Thompson seedless is such a big, important, and popular grape in California, other than the fact that it's a big producer, is that it basically is a three-way grape. You can go to the winery with it, or you can make raisins out of it, or you can sell it for table fruit. So it's a three-way grape. And this same sort of use of table grapes and Thompson seedless also applies in countries like Australia and South Africa, where we have the same type of climate and economic conditions. Whereas in Europe, as I said once before, you don't have the big table grape market, and you don't have the climate for raisins, and you do have the real market for wine. So in Europe, it's mostly strictly right down the line for wine production wine varieties. Now, I said we haven't passed this handout. Now we get down to California, and I would like to let's see, you start those from this side, I guess. That's the 68. Each one's supposed to get a pair of these. You two guys on the floor can get special privileges, I guess. You pass some of these up through here. What I've got here and what I'm handing out is 68 versus 1970 plantings of the most important varieties in California. So you want to wind up for this discussion with a copy of each of these so I can show you some of these changes. And last time I didn't even keep a copy for myself, so I better keep a copy this time. Now, has everybody got both copies? What do you need? You're getting it there.
You need the 70, you need the 68.
All right, we're through with the world situation. Now we're going to zero in on California. And what I've handed out to you was the top 25 varieties by acreage in 68 and the top 25 in 1970. And as soon as I can get the 72 data, which is we have now, I'll make the similar sheet for 72 for the top 25 varieties so that you can have the collection, because it's very interesting to follow the trend of planting in California. By the way, on this matter then of this graph that you just looked at, you can get confused over how the distribution goes, but over the years, not just counting the last 2 or 3 years, what you can really do, and the easiest way to remember it, is to say that California grapes, you divide it into sixths, and you can say 3/6 of our California production goes into wine, and 2/6 goes into raisins, and 1/6 goes into fresh fruit. Now, it's this type of thing which, when it gets around to this statistics, that I like to boil it down to good generalities that are easy to remember. You can say, sure, what's the difference? That's a half, and that's a third, and that's a sixth. But if you divide it in 6, to me, to my mind at least, it's a little easier to remember that way. So that this has been the traditional way it's gone. Now, in the last year or two, because of the great demand on wine and the troubles with Chavez and so forth on labor unions for fresh fruit and so on, the fresh fruit has dropped down some, and the raisins have dropped down some. In case you don't know it, I checked the other day in the grocery store, and raisins are 75 cents a pound. They used to be about 25 cents a pound, because so much of the Thompson seedless that normally would go into raisins has been shunted into wine. Now, I was just reviewing, and I didn't bring it with me, but fortunately I can remember that the 1973 crop report that was just in, well, this was a big year, in case you don't realize that this is the second largest crop year that we've had, and the largest crush year that we've ever had. See, the second largest crop, but because of this great emphasis on wine, more and more of the Thompsons so forth have gone into crush. So this year we had something like 3.5 million tons production. And by the way, this is on about 600,000 acres as it's planted right now. But of course, a lot of this, about 100,000 acres, so that isn't even in production. It's young vines. And out of this year we crushed, made it, sent to the winery, 2,250,000 tons out of the total. So you see over here I just said half of it goes to wine, and here I'm showing that this year 2/3 of it went to the winery. Two-thirds out of the 3.5 million went to that, and then we left, that's a rough estimate, and then for raisins it was something slightly under 1 million tons. And then, of course, the rest, this was 1 million tons minus, let's say. It's about 900,000 or so. And then fresh would make up the remainder, which would be something like 300,000 or so. This makes 250. That'll only leave 250. But I guess I hate to make you change your note, but let's put this down to about 900,000 to make things come out all right. And then this leaves as an estimate on table fruit of about 350,000 tons. You see, we've really dropped terrifically on fresh. We've dropped some on raisins. Raisins came back some because of this $600 or $700 a ton that's the going market now for raisins. But they didn't. But fresh really dropped, and it will be slow to come back. So that's how the crop is used overall now under the 1973 crop. But now we get down to, okay, in California, those of you who've taken 105, what did you have to learn? 60 varieties? Something like that. And somebody in lab Monday asked me if we had quite a few varieties out there in the vineyard, and I said, well, not more than about 3,000 named varieties. But you get down to the idea that in 105 you have to learn about 60. But when you get down, when you get down to what really adds up here in this 1968 and 1970 handout, you see 25 varieties in 68 made up 93% of the total, and in 1970, 25 varieties made up 88%. So all of these other varieties that are around, which you have to learn in class, and which I really object to you having to learn, because it seems to me if you learn the varieties that make up 90–95% of the stage, you don't need to learn all these little unimportant varieties. But maybe for North Coast wineries and so forth, you need to know that. But now holding this 70 and 68 side by side, I want to show you a few little changes that took place just in those 2 years. And then when I get the 72 data, we'll compare it with the 68 and really show you some continuing extremes. For example, now, when you look on 68, that's that hard-to-read ditto that you've got, French Colombar is ranked 15th, and with 4,000 acres. 2 years later, it's in 6th place with 18,500 acres. That's sort of a jump, isn't it? And then go down and pick up on one which isn't even on the 68 chart, but ranks in 9th place in 1970 as Chenin Blanc with 8,500 acres, and it didn't even rank in the top 25 in 68. Both of those are wine grapes that are being planted very, very heavily in the interior valleys, where it's rather warm. And then take Barbera, number 10 on your 70, with 7,500 acres. Well, it's lost in the woods as far as the top 25 back in 68. There probably weren't more than 300 or 400 acres of it. And suddenly we got 7,500 acres of Barbera. And that was in 70. It was planted very heavily in 71, 72, 73. So all of those French Colombar, Chenin Blanc, Barbera, and Cabernet, which is the next one to discuss, all of these are extremely up over just this beginning data or beginning trend, which is shown by just this 2-year differential. Cabernet on the 70 ranks 11th, and with 7,500 acres, and on the 68 it ranked 21st with 2,000 acres. So if you want to know what varieties are being planted and where this big acreage increase is coming from, that's where you can get an idea from these leading varieties. Ruby Cabernet, number 14 on your 70 with 5,000 acres. Probably back in 68, maybe it had may have had 1,000 acres, maybe 500. So those are some of the big leaders. All of those, French Colombard, Chenin Blanc, Barbera, and Ruby Cabernet, those four are going strong in the interior valley. And of course, all of you are involved in enology at all know that the whole coastal area is going crazy over Cabernet. So this gives you some idea of the shift in the emphasis to wine grapes and what types are being planted. As you look at this 1968 data, it shows about 456,000 acres, say 450 because I like to round things off. In 1970 they had 500,000. The latest statistics that has come out shows that we now have something like 600,000 acres of vineyard land in California. What it really means is that and I'm giving all this in terms so that you can remember it. Now, some of you want to come up and argue whether it's off 1,000 here, 1,000 there, or something else. But as a rough rule of thumb, you can say that for the past 3 years, of 70, 71, 72, 73, we have averaged a planting of about 40,000 acres per year. One year it'd be 50, the next year it'd be 35. But the average for the past 3 years has been 40,000 acres or so of new planting each year. And of this new planting, at least for the 1972 plantings, which I dug out of the 40,000 acres or so that's been added, only 5,000 acres involves table fruit or raisin varieties such as Thompson. In other words, the great big planting emphasis, as all of you well know, has been on wine grapes of this group that I just named. So that we have increased our acres now from around 450,000 in 68 to 600,000 as of the end of 1973. And from all the rumors and so forth that we hear, there'll be another 30,000 or so acres planted in 74, which will put us, we still, with 600,000, are not at the greatest grape acreage the state has ever known, but I think by this time next year we can say that we will have the greatest grape acreage. Now just to throw a little doomsday comment onto this. All of you are eager to get out of here and plant your own 40 acres, build your own winery and get rich while grape prices are high and wine prices are high. But last year, we only, to compare 1973 with last year, 1971, we only crushed about a million. I don't have the exact figures, but it's around 1.5 million tons, 1,400,000 and something thousand, were crushed in 1972. This was a bad year. So this year you see how much we've jumped up on the crush. So one reason wine is short is because we've had 2 or 3 rather low productive years, 71, 72 being one of the lowest. This year, if you follow the trade at all, with this terrific crop that they had, and much of it in the coastal counties from some of these new vineyards coming in, the wineries, believe it or not, when you talk about wine shortage and so forth, were hard-pressed to try to find some place to store their wine. They're chock-a-block full of everything that they can put wine in. Of course, this new wine, you can't drink it right away, especially from the coast county, but every barrel is full. Now, if you crush, let's round off the 250 and forget it to illustrate what I'm talking about. Let's say you crush 2 million tons. You get 150 gallons of wine per ton. So if you crush 2 million, you've got 300 million gallons of wine. Gallons of wine that would produce this fall. The per capita consumption in the United States is something under 1.5 gallons. So we have produced enough wine in California alone to meet the market on an annual basis in this last year. But in addition to that, you've got to take into account the imports, maybe or maybe several million gallons. And you've also, in spite of the fact that we have 90% of the grape acreage and all that goodness, you still have got to consider the wines that are made in the Northeast, New York State, Ohio, and so forth, and the wines that are made up in Washington and Oregon from the Labruscas. So what it really means then that we produce 300 million, which alone is enough to take care of the wine consumption, say 2 years from now in a single year. But we're going to have to start worrying about the fact that maybe we might begin to once again approach a little surplus problem, unless we can really gear people up to raise their gallon and a half per person up to something approaching this 30 gallons that the Italians and French and Argentinians drink. And of course, this is where I feel that I have people come to me and ask me, well, what do you think about the, you know, beginning to look a little scary. I just went through this story with you here. It looked like we're almost up to the point of taking care of the market. But I cannot help but feel that we're going to maybe raise this up to maybe 2 gallons. And remember that we only produce 1.5 gallons per person in a good year. You raise the consumption by 0.5 gallon, and we're once again in a shortage. So I don't think that we really worry about having a surplus of wine. What you're going to have to worry about is that the price of grapes and wine has to level off, if not drop a little bit. When we really get up to the point where we have the barrels all full and plenty of wine, I really wonder who's going to pay $800 a ton for Cabernet. That's 40 cents a pound in a big tub to make wine. You get 750 bottles of wine out of a ton of grapes. So in the past several years, we've paid, the wineries have had to pay $1 a bottle for the juice before they start. And I think that we're going to see that the high price of grapes is going to level off. And so many of you come to me individually. I'll just say it here to the group, that when you start calculating investment and all this business on planting grapes, you had better not count $800 a ton, but at the very most optimistic, figure it 2/3 of whatever today's price is, and then do your calculations based on that. I think the price of grapes will taper off, but I don't think we ever get back to the point where you can't find a home for good wine grapes. And I guess that's about where we have to stop today.